The camera is on. I'm talking to the camera. I'm talking to my audience. My audience obviously is not talking to me because they're not seeing me live, but that's perfectly okay because we're going to do a video response. This video response is going to go out to Rachel Stevens, and that's because you uploaded several videos on the topic of modesty, as well as other videos on other topics, which of course I watched. That's right, I watched several of your videos, and I decided to give you some commentary on several of the topics you brought up. So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you and see what you have to say in response to what I'm going to say to you. Alright. Let's start this way. In the middle of your three-part presentation on modesty, you mentioned that young adults spend too much time in school. I highly agree with you on this. Okay? It's a myth to say that young adults can't remember large amounts of information. And I have provided proof of this not only throughout my own YouTube channel, but I wrote Kindle books. The first two provides unequivocal proof that these kids spend way too much time in school. And this should not happen. But I'm going to provide even more proof of this, okay? Now, I'm going to go ahead and leave hyperlinks down here in the description below to my first two Kindle books. You can go ahead and read those if you like. Or you can go through my YouTube channel and see what I'm talking about. But, let's go on. In ancient times, information was transmitted orally. Not everything was written down. As a matter of fact, until, well, let's just say a couple of 100 years before the 1st century, everything was transmitted pretty much orally. Yes, you have your Egyptian hieroglyphs, but I'm talking about on a regular basis, most of that information was transmitted orally. Many young adults in those times were required to memorize history and other cultural information for many reasons. And I'm sure you can think of a lot of reasons why they were required to memorize so much stuff. One of the biggest reasons was due to invasions by foreign powers. Let me say that again. One of the biggest reasons why these young adults had to remember so much stuff was because nations at that time were often invaded by other nations. Okay? The best example of this can be found in the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And I have provided a hyperlink to that right down here in the description below. Yes, there's lots of hyperlinks, and they're in order, and you can go ahead and follow along as I continue this presentation. Even if a nation was able to repel a foreign power, they might lose valuable written information. No one should forget that the printing press was invented after the 1st century. If you don't believe me, I got a hyperlink for that as well, right down here. So obtaining a written text was a real challenge. It's a well-known fact that the literacy rate in the time of Jesus was low. So finding and paying a scribe to write down your text wasn't easy or cheap. You should check out how costly it was to get, a certain amount of papyrus, not to mention the ink, and then to find somebody that would actually write that stuff down. It wasn't cheap, and it wasn't easy to find somebody like that. Yet, according to Quintilian, orators and others too, and these would be scholarly people, often transcribe summaries of oral presentations. That way, they can follow along in their notes, and they can still present things orally. Okay? As a matter of fact, Quintilian debated Leonus on the use of these summaries. You can see this debate in Book 10 of Quintilian's Institutio Horatia. And I have a hyperlink to that down here too. Sometimes the orators created summaries of their presentations themselves. But most of the time, these orators paid scribes boy, don't you just love the word transcribe? Then you're trying to say scribe and transcribe in the same sentence. Yeah, that always goes out well, doesn't it? Let me try this one more time. But most of the time, these orators paid scribes to transcribe their summaries. That's better. As I stated earlier, the literacy rate of the general population in the times of Jesus was low. So orators heavily relied on their memory to present their material. Also, you had to keep in mind that they used hand gestures a lot. They used hand gestures. There's another word that'll really trip you up. You want a tongue-tying thing right there? Gestures. And you could use gestures to jester. Yeah, that's a good one. But anyway, that'll help you remember that one. The difference between gestures and jester. There you go. But anyway, orators would use gestures during their presentations for dramatic emphasis. Okay? Now, another reason why orators transcribed summaries of their presentations was because orators were not immortal. Hate to tell you that, but they really weren't. I know you watched that movie Highlander, and if you didn't, I know a lot of people in my audience did, but no, they were not immortal, okay? And that's what made the burning of the Library of Alexandria so tragic. Think about it. If there had been like a couple of hundred people that had memorized all the texts that had been in the Library of Alexandria, they could have just written out brand new copies and thrown it into the new library, and there you go, they would have had it. But by that time, not very many people wanted to go in there and memorize a whole bunch of texts, and that's why we've lost them. Okay? So did anyone teach people how to remember so much information in antiquity? Why, the answer is yes, absolutely. Aristotle wrote a document entitled On Memory and Reminiscence. There's another tough word to remember. And if you want to see this particular document here, go right ahead, right down here. In the description below, I have another hyperlink for you to take a look at. Over the years, this document has been, pretty much forgotten by most people. But Harry Lorayne wrote a book less than 50 years ago that revived these ideas. Okay? So as I've clearly demonstrated, learning lots of material for most people is not only possible, but very easy to do. That means that kids can learn large amounts of information. They can learn it in a relatively quick period of time, and they can graduate early, get their college work done early, and be able to live out their lives when they're healthy and well enough to do it. So don't tell me there's only a rare few kids that can't do that. Most kids can do this. When I talk about the general population, most kids can do this. Don't tell me it can't be done, because I've clearly demonstrated that right here on my YouTube channel, so don't even tell me that. Okay, now I also agree that in this day and age, it's very important that people need to retain large amounts of information. And here's the reason why. We are no longer competing with other human beings anymore. No, no. We're competing with computers. Now, I've left a hyperlink down here that shows you a computer called the ENIAC. And yes, ENIAC is an acronym. Okay, it's an acronym. And you can look this all up for yourself, and you can learn all about the ENIAC. Well, the thing is that was maybe 60, 70 years ago. Your smartphone today is faster, it's smarter, it's smaller than the ENIAC. I mean, look at the size of the ENIAC. You think about how small, how fast, and how smart your smartphone actually is. Shoot, there's an app for practically everything. Of course, I'd like to see the app that washes your dishes and dries your laundry, but that's another time for another matter. So, as computers, they are getting progressively smaller, faster, and smarter. As that happens, we're going to compete more and more with computers and less with other human beings. Okay? So people will either keep up with that technology, or they're going to be completely overwhelmed with it. They're going to find themselves on the unemployment line. It's going to be rather quick, too. I can tell you that. Now, I could go on with my discussion on intelligence, but I think everybody here gets the point. If you don't, ask me, and I'll drill in your head. Okay? So let's move on to what you said about this rather, well, how shall we say it? A scantily term called lust. Yeah. Now, you make a claim about Isaiah that I don't think you could definitively prove. Okay, now, you are referring to Isaiah chapter 20. Now, there are a lot of people that agree with your position, but there's also just as many people who don't. Okay? You claim that Isaiah was ordered by God to not wear any clothes. What did the scriptures actually say? God ordered Isaiah to remove his sandals and his sackcloth. Now, for those of you who don't know, in ancient times, most people wore a loincloth. Okay? And it did expose the buttocks. But that's all it exposed. Nothing else. So, to say that definitively, that it can't be refuted, that Isaiah wasn't wearing any clothes at all, that's a bit of a stretch. Depends on who you ask. So unless you can 100% definitively, and don't just go flying into the Strong's Concordance, I want you to find reputable people that will back you up and out-argue the other people. So it's just definitive, and there's no way that they can out-argue that. Yeah. So I would suggest making a far stronger case if you're going to mention something like that. Alright, now keep in mind that God himself gave animal skins to Adam and Eve. Okay? And also keep in mind that when David's first wife accused him of being, well, for having a wardrobe malfunction, if you want to call it that, well, that wasn't quite accurate either, was it? Oh no. Go ahead and check out that story. You'll find out he was wearing the ephod. So, no, wrong there. Now, this whole thing is revolving around the Hebrew word Aram. Now, again, in Hebrew, they didn't have vowels back then. Okay, but this is the modern translation of the ancient Hebrew word. So, we call it Aram, but that's not what they called it back then. So, there you go. So anyway, let's go on. I will say, however, in your defense, that I saw several web articles about how the Assyrians treated the Egyptians after they were captured. And I have to say it wasn't very pleasant. The Assyrians removed the limbs of some of their prisoners after they removed their clothing. And they treated their prisoners in other cruel ways. And there's a web article that describes exactly what they did. And I have to say that the first Olympic athletes way back in the ancient times, they were in the buff. So there were other cultures that just, they didn't have the same standard about being clothed as we do today. But this was not always the case in the Israelite camp. Okay? God wanted people to wear clothing, not expose themselves all over the place. If you don't believe me, you read the Torah. Okay? Now, as for modesty, the Bible clearly states that ladies, when they are worshiping God in fellowship, shall not have braided hair. They will not wear gold or pearls or costly attire. If you don't believe me, you can look up 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9. So God does have an opinion about attire. I also want to mention that I discussed head coverings, female head coverings, that females used to wear in worship services, and I have a hyperlink to that discussion. I had a discussion on this on YouTube, and I have a hyperlink to that video discussion right down here in the description below. So there's another hyperlink you're going to go to. So before you make your next presentation about modesty, I hope you will provide a more detailed presentation with lots of proof. In the meantime, in this video, I will provide a little more critique about some other topics you presented recently. And yes, I've been paying very close attention. First of all, you said, first of all, you should scripturally back up your claim that Satan and Google and YouTube are one and the same. I don't remember that in the Bible. Okay? You're going to have to back that up scripturally, because it's just not there. I know, I checked it. Trust me, it ain't there. There is not one reference to YouTube or Google in the Bible. So you better back that one up. Alright? And quit mentioning the bell. And I'll give you a good reason why in a minute. But first of all, if you guys want to know about the bell notifications, the subscribe button, I have a video about that. It's right down, the hyperlink's right down there. It'll tell you exactly what the subscribe button and the bell notifications are all about. So you don't need to mention the bell anymore. Now, why am I telling you this? I'll tell you why. Because not everybody in the world has an unlimited data on their internet. Some people have data limits. I'm a Comcast customer. I have a data limit. Okay, it's a rather large one, but I still have one. And I know lots of people that have data limits. And if you don't get to your point right away and don't provide them with a lot of good, valuable information, they're going to turn you off. And rightfully so. So don't do that anymore. Not only is it annoying because we hear all the freaking time, but on top of that, it's eating up their data limit. And if they're going to learn from you, or they're going to learn from me, we have to keep that video down a little bit so they're not getting slammed with a video that's going to eat up half their data limit. That's wrong. Okay? Now, investing in God's kingdom is not the same thing as purchasing God's power. Those two are not the same. Okay? People don't go out to banks and buy money. It doesn't happen that way. Okay? So your analogy is somewhat flawed. However, in your defense, I can say that if you don't dedicate your money to God in prayer before you place the money in the offering plate, God won't grant you anything. That's the first mistake. Now here's the key. You're dedicating it to who? Not to the minister, to God. You're bypassing the minister. Okay? This is a personal relationship you're supposed to have. You're supposed to be talking to God all the time. On that point, you are correct. If you don't have a personal relationship with God, you can put as much money in that offering plate as you want. It will do absolutely no good whatsoever. And yes, the ministers are selling a bunch of garbage when they say, oh, if you put the money in the offering plate, by golly, you'll get this windfall of money. It doesn't work that way. You are correct on that. Okay? You have to first dedicate it to God. That means you have to have a personal relationship with Him. You have to pray to Him. You have to be in constant prayer to Him, or it doesn't work. 2, it's not a windfall of money. And here's the big mistake on that one. Okay? The second mistake comes from the parable of the fish. Do you remember when Jesus pulled the coin out of the fish? Okay? Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Okay? What was the central message? What was on that coin? Well, I'll tell you what was on that coin. A pagan symbol. Jesus did not want pagan symbols inside His temple. Remember, Jesus is God. He does not want that in His temple. Okay? So, why would you think that God, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit would suddenly give you a whole windfall of money when that money has pagan symbols on it? He's not going to do that. That's not the way God operates. So you say, well, how does God operate? If you have a personal relationship with God and you dedicate the money, and really it shouldn't be money at all either. Okay, you should be dedicating chairs and food and clothing and that kind of thing. That's what you should be putting in the offering plate, not money. I mean, money's convenient, but that's not really what you're supposed to be putting in the offering plate. You shouldn't even be putting in the offering plate. You should just bring it up to the donation center and say, it's been blessed, and here you go. That's how it's supposed to work. Okay? Now, I know that not all people can do that, and I understand that. But if you're going to use money, make sure you dedicate it to God before you put it in the offering plate. You make sure that He knows that you want Him to have it. Now, what does He give to you in response? You have a personal relationship with Him, and you're putting the money that has been dedicated to Him in the offering plate. What happens then? Well, your car doesn't break down as often. You don't get sick as much. Your prosperity comes from different things. But it doesn't come in money. You don't just suddenly get a check in the mail. That does not work. That's not the way it works. Maybe you're in litigation, and all of a sudden the litigation goes your way because you have a personal relationship with God. That's how it works. Okay? So if you're thinking you're going to windfall of money, boy, you're in big time error. And that's why. Okay? Now the most important thing is if you're going to dedicate money to God, you first have to have a personal relationship with Him. And that's why a lot of times it doesn't work. You're praying over it, but you don't have a you know why God designed it that way? So you'd talk to Him. You'd have a reason to talk to Him. He wants you to talk to Him. He shares information with you that He didn't share with anybody else. It's kind of an exclusive thing. He might show you an opportunity that nobody else ever sees. He may give you education that He doesn't give to somebody else. Why? Because He can entrust you with it. That's why. So, in order for this whole thing to work, you have to have a personal relationship with God. You have to dedicate what you're donating. And if you can, and I recommend this, I would rather you give food, clothing, tables, chairs, anything other than money. I'd rather you give material possessions over money, because the money has pagan symbols on it. If you can find money that doesn't have pagan symbols, dedicate that. Otherwise, you make sure to dedicate items instead. It'll work a lot better. I promise you. Okay? Now, how do you properly communicate with God? Well, Jesus gave you the whole message right there. You remember the Lord's Prayer? That is not something you're supposed to chant. That is a blueprint. Okay? You know how houses have blueprints? Well, prayer has a blueprint too, and that's it. You're supposed to fill in the blanks. You're supposed to, first of all, hallow the name of God. That means you're supposed to praise Him. The first part of your prayer should start with the praising of God. Okay? You're supposed to acknowledge the fact that He owns everything. He's just lending stuff to you for a while, until you die. Okay? Eventually, one day, you die. I'm sorry, it happens. That's just life. While you're on this earth, He lends you things. He lends you a body. He lended you a home, a car, this, that, whatever. But ultimately, it still belongs to Him. See what I mean? Give us this day our daily bread. You are actually acknowledging that God is your provider. So you tell God, this is the kind of food I need. How am I going to get it? And you're asking God to forgive you of your sins just as you forgive the trespasses that other people do to you. So that means you're supposed to be a more forgiving person. Not easily angered. See what I mean? So, anyway. And I can go on and on, but I think you get the idea. And I'm sure you're going to make that into your presentation. Go ahead. Now, you should be so used to communicating with God on a regular basis that when you come to the point where you're actually going to dedicate something to God, not necessarily money, but something, it should be just instinctual. It's just like when you learn how to type or ride a bike, it's just instinctual. Even if you've gone from riding a bike for a long period of time, you can get back on it and you can learn. That is not a problem. And by the way, God despises long, repetitious prayers. Want my proof? Check out Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Since this is actually the case, and you can check this out for yourself, why did you offer such a lengthy prayer in your video entitled, "Are Christians Required to Tithe?" Give me a break. It didn't have to be that long. Offering a prayer is great, but not that long. Keep in mind that not everybody has a, shall we say, a large data limit. Okay, it's not only unnecessary, but people like myself, like I said, I have data limits, so it's important for YouTube creators like us to not do that. I could say more at this point, but I'm starting to eat up people's data limits, and I know I have a lot of students that are watching me, and they have limited data limits. But I felt that in this particular case, I would give you a rather lengthy presentation solely for the purpose. I packed this video full of information, full of hyperlinks, so you guys will learn a lot of stuff in a short period of time. And yes, this presentation was half as long as your presentation on tithing, yet it contains tons more information than yours. If I find time at some point in the future, I'll cover more. My point to you is, pack more information in a shorter period of time and present better arguments. Alright, well, I'm wasting time here, so thank you very much for watching this presentation. I look forward to seeing what you have to say about all this. This will be quite interesting. Alright, for the rest of you, my wonderful students, thank you very much for watching this presentation. I will tell you more in a future video, so I'd like for you to stay tuned.